Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Let's Talk session that's focused on misinformation and disinformation. I'm Melissa Gonville. I'm the CEO of YWCA Delaware. For those of you who aren't maybe familiar with YWCA Delaware and what we do, we are a nonprofit organization that focuses on providing housing, sexual assault and domestic violence response, economic empowerment programs, youth development programs, and community engagement. So first, for this discussion, I'd like to welcome our two esteemed panelists, Joanne Miller and Jacob Owens, and ask them to introduce themselves, give you a little information about their current roles as well as their background. So Joanne, you want to go first?
Sure. So I am a professor of political science and psychology at the University of Delaware. I teach classes in the dreaded statistics and research design. I'm a political psychologist, so I teach interdisciplinary courses in political psychology and public opinion. These days I'm researching primarily what motivates people to believe or why people believe conspiracy theories. And I've been working on this project since at least 2012. Lots to talk about there.
Interesting. Jacob.
Yeah, hi. So I'm Jake. Everybody calls me Jake Owens. I am editor-in-chief of Spotlight Delaware, which is a fairly new nonprofit investigative newsroom that covers the state of Delaware and particularly public policy in the state of Delaware. I've been a journalist for the last 16 years or so, and I've been able to lead a variety of newspapers in both Maryland and Delaware, and have really seen the changing ecosystem that we work within.
Great. Well, welcome both of you. Thanks so much for taking the time to be with us this evening. So let's talk. If anyone on the webcast, just letting everybody know who's on. There aren't, it's not huge today. There's 14 people, 15 participants besides us. So if you want to go off mute and ask a question in the middle of this, feel free to do so. Otherwise, type it in the chat and we'll be monitoring the chat for questions. So I'm going to get it started. Let's start off by defining what is misinformation and disinformation, and kind of what's the difference between them, especially when it comes to journalism. So whichever one of you wants to take that.
I'll let the professor handle that first.
Yes.
So
I'll take the definitions and then I'll pass it on to you, Jake, about with regard to the media. So misinformation is simply factually incorrect information. And the sharing of, when we say misinformation is being shared, the distinction between misinformation and disinformation is that disinformation is the intentional knowing sharing of factually incorrect information with the intent to deceive. Misinformation, on the other hand, is sharing of misinformation that is not intentional. And not explicitly intentional.
Okay. Yep. And then when it comes to journalism, Jake.
Yeah, I think that one of the simplest ways to really think about mis and dis is misinformation is probably what your uncle is sharing with you. Most days of the week, if you have an active chat thread, you may be getting stuff that people are seeing in social media, and it may be based on a kernel of truth somewhere, but kind of like a game of whisper down the lane, it gets distorted by the time it ultimately makes it to the end point. And so usually it's unintentionally bad information. Disinformation is usually coming from a bad actor. Sometimes it's a foreign country, sometimes it's a political party, sometimes it's really just people with an agenda that they're trying to push. And so it really kind of threads the needle from electoral interference by Russia to trying to distort a policy discussion with your intended point of view. And so it takes an educated media literate person to really be able to read through what are the intentions of the person that are sharing the information.
You guys just brought me back to my childhood on the misinformation one, how you played that game. I think they called it, I don't, it may have been Whisper Down the Lane. I think it might have been called Telephone, where you
Telephone.
say
Yep.
something to somebody, they something,
Mhm.
and that by the end, you're like, wait a minute, that was nothing like what the first person said. So yeah,
Mhm.
that definitely happens. So I think right now we hear a ton about misinformation and disinformation, but it's not new. It's something that's happened for many years. So, Jake, can you talk a little bit about the history of media and the concept of fake news and misinformation and disinformation in the past?
Yeah, and one of the, I think, the most interesting, I think that people need to keep in mind that as much as things feel different, they're really much the same as they've always been. And so when you think about journalism in general, I mean, where did it start? It started really as newspapers and information being shared by political parties. So, the original newspapers were, talk pieces for the Democratic Party or the Republican Party or the Whig Party. It wasn't always meant to be sharing of factual information. It was meant to support a particular ideology. And over the years, that really started to devolve into what was known as yellow journalism, really in the early 20th century. And so it supported a particular point of view. And so um, as that goes along, it only gets more difficult as we've entered the internet age, and now it's even more troublesome to try to figure out, how, what is the information factual? Is it coming from a slanted point of view? It's not necessarily new, but it's certainly becoming, a more high volume and more erratic kind of take in the internet age.
Yeah, and I'd be interested, Joanne, as you said that you were studying conspiracy theories and things
Yeah.
like that. Like, how does that has there been a rise in conspiracy theories and how what do what do you think about that?
So the short answer is we don't know in one respect. From like a real like scientific empirical perspective, we weren't studying belief in conspiracy theories or the spread of conspiracy theories, as scholars until the Obama administration, pretty much. A little bit before that. But what I can say is that the research that has been done on this issue that has actually been kind of ingenious. And in fact, what they did was they looked at letters to the editor to the New York Times going back to 1890s. And what they did is they coded the letters for whether they mentioned a conspiracy theory. And so as a sort of time series, over time of how many of these letters focus on a conspiracy theory, it's kind of a way to gauge what's going on in the public. And what that research shows is that going from 1890 to 2010, and it does stop in 2010, there isn't a consistent upwards trend. And so this does capture some of the internet age and some of social media. But again, with the caveat that it does stop at 2010. There are some spikes. So there's a spike during the Red Scare in the 1960s. There's a little bit of a spike during 9/11. There's actually a spike in the 1890s with the concern about banks and conspiracy theories in around the banking industry. But outside of those spikes, there isn't a consistent trend upwards. It feels like we're in the age of misinformation, the age of conspiracy theories, because we see more of them. But that doesn't necessarily mean that more people are believing them than believed them before.
Interesting. And Leslie put in the chat, wasn't the Salem witch trials and things like that considered a conspiracy?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we'll come back to at some point hysteria and emotions and how emotions play into the spread and the belief, but I'll hold off on that for now.
Yeah, well, I think honestly, social media is a big part of the reason why we think that there's, so whether there are more conspiracy theories or not, they are out there and everybody can see them because people are on social media, people propagate them. So And I'll ask either one of you to jump in on how do you think social media and, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, et cetera, has played into all of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it serves as a catalyst, and I think that I think Joanne would tell you that it's not new, but it's kind of been put on steroids. And so, whereas somebody may have harbored, feelings about a conspiracy around the JFK assassination, 50 years ago, the issue is now you can go online and find thousands of other people that also agree with your point of view and therefore reinforce your point of view. Um, and unfortunately, we're not just stuck in this feeling about conspiracy theory now. We're
Mhm.
now dealing with fake news or a distortion of, factual information, and it becomes quite difficult as somebody that tries to police his extended family chat thread with all kinds of
That's impossible.
all kinds of nonsense, and I try to be the one that's like, show me the source. If you are not savvy enough to read through, it becomes much more difficult. And I will say one of the biggest problems that we really encounter is really kind of what's termed journal washing. So it's this idea that anybody can create a brand, somebody the Epoch Times or whatever it is, and because we are able to give it this masthead, anything we now publish is given credence because we are calling ourselves a newspaper. And it's only gotten much more difficult and much put into much more hyperdrive in really the last
Mhm.
decade. So you've got blogs that maybe used to be fringe are now getting a seat in the White House press room. And it's every step along the way you're only giving more credence to these ideas that were once fringe. Used to be a small subsect of people, and now we're kind of playing catch up and whack-a-mole with these spreaders of mis and disinformation. So
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, one of the things that social media has done is it's democratized the information environment. And there are some benefits to that, but there are also downsides. And it means that anyone can throw a piece of misinformation or conspiracy theory or fake news against the internet wall and see if it sticks. And so it makes it easier for bad actors to throw a lot of bad, I'll just use
malarkey.
the word bad stuff in the world out there and see if even one of those pieces takes hold. And it also enables uh, just ordinary people to do the same thing. And importantly, it also enables people to monetize misinformation and disinformation and conspiracy theories. And that's something that is absolutely a product of the internet and social media age that wasn't happening to the extent. I can't say that misinformation wasn't monetized back in the day, because all sorts of phony health cures and were all monetized to the detriment of a lot of people back in the day. But it's at a greater scale now because the information moves faster through the ecosystem.
Talk
And
a little bit, just in case people don't know how it gets monetized. Like how, I'm assuming it's by selling ads, with the more people that they can spread it to. I don't know if there's anything else to that.
I mean, that's certainly some of it. So the bigger following you have with regard to likes, clicks, shares, comments, um, social media companies pay you for those likes, clicks. You can host advertisements on your channel or your site. And the more engagement you get on your content, the more money you can make. The more engagement you get, also, the more that information gets pushed up in people's feeds as well. And so there are a number of incentives that lead to the spread of misinformation that, again, it's absolutely a social media phenomenon to the scale that we
Yeah, and
see
we'll
today.
get outside of the social media aspect in a couple minutes, but the talk about the algorithms. Either one of you, like how algorithms fit into. Some of us have. I can't even remember the name of that documentary that I watched, but it was like, oh man. You talk a little bit about how algorithms play into that. And Leslie, I did see your other comment. We are going to get to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think Joanne is absolutely correct. And, one of the challenges, if you look at even the 90s, which feels like 100 years ago now, and today, what was, even if you wanted to spread disinformation, what did you have to do? There was no internet. You had to invest money to get a printing press or to rent space on a printing press. You had to buy paper, you had to buy ink, you had to write the material, you had to print it, you had to disseminate it, you had to try to gather public opinion. Now, you don't have to do any of that. All you need is a cell phone, ideally. YouTube is free. They pay you per eyeball. The more eyeballs you get, the more money you can get out of their engagement. The more eyeballs you get, the more likely it is you can sell to weight loss supplements or, disaster prep kits or whatever it is you're feeding into. And the ready availability of that revenue stream has only led people to chase, our worst common denominator, which is our endless fascination with conspiracy theory and information that fits my biases. And it's it unfortunately is a reward loop for chasing down that wormhole. And so I do think that's where social media has started to change things. And why do we monetize that? Because Facebook and YouTube and Instagram want to keep you on their platforms as long as they possibly can. So if they can get you reeled in to watch a 3-hour video about how 9/11 was an inside job, they're going to do it. And they're not particularly caring about, what the societal outcome is on that, as long as it's good for the bottom line.
Yeah, and on the topics of sort of algorithms and showing people what they want to see, certainly before algorithms, people themselves chose what content that they would read or watch or listen to, and it's a basic human motivation to seek out content that already confirms our pre-existing beliefs and attitudes and opinions and maybe partisan leanings.
Confirmation bias. Yep.
Confirmation
Sure.
bias,
Yep.
absolutely. Motivated reasoning is the broad concept for this. So we take in information that is consistent with our beliefs, and we act, and we're not, and we accept that information uncritically, and that's the key point. We accept it uncritically. We're more likely to counter argue information that is inconsistent with our beliefs. But if we see a piece of misinformation that is consistent with our beliefs, we're going to accept it. Now add to that algorithms are themselves showing you content that they think that you're most likely to want to see, then you don't even have to be an active participant in selecting, right? And when we're on these platforms, it's not at the top of our minds that they're feeding us content that we want to see. So as we're reading or watching or listening, we think we're getting an accurate depiction of the world, and we're not. And because we're getting a depiction that is consistent with our views, we want to believe that's the accurate. And so it's like this death circle, this death spiral of misinformation. There was something else I was going to say about, the other thing I want to say briefly about echo chambers and algorithms is that as much as we talk about them, they can also be a little bit overblown in terms of what really is going on. Only about 10% of the public is in a real tight social media echo chamber when it comes to politics. A lot of people on social media pay very little attention to politics and aren't exposed to much politics at all, right? But studies that look at these networks and look at how many people are talking to who on say, back in the day when Twitter allowed these data to be used by researchers, about 10%. The downside is that 10% happens to be the most active 10%, the most politically active
I was going
10%.
to say 10% sounded really low to me, but okay.
It's low, but they're the most active,
Mm.
right? And so the effects of those echo chambers are exacerbated by the fact that those are the people who are acting on the information.
I think
Whether
I
it
have
is
read that a very, very small percentage of people spread like the
the
vast
vast majority.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Interesting. We'll talk a little bit later about how to counter them, but let's go a little outside of social media. So can you talk a little bit about how false news can spread? Because social media is the easiest way by far, as both of you have just said. But can you talk a little bit about how it can spread outside of social media? Like there's a study that was done in 2016 involving 8,000 US students that Stanford University did and found that more than 80% of middle schoolers believed that an advertisement labeled as sponsored content was actually a news story. So even though things are usually labeled sponsored content when they are, but anyway, what outside of social media, what are some other ways?
Yeah, I mean, and I know we were going to kind of dig into the history of it. Maybe this is the moment, the moment we're looking for that. But a couple things, especially when it comes to misinformation, in particular, is journalism really ever since the late 80s when TV journalism and broadcast journalism really became a 24/7 sport. We've seen a change from kind of the Walter Cronkite type journalism to a rush to be breaking, to rush to be first type journalism. And sometimes even the best journalists unintentionally spread misinformation. And so, some couple high profile examples would be like Richard Jewell, for anybody that remembers, the Atlanta Olympics bombing. As it turned out, Richard Jewell was a security guard that actually saved dozens of people's lives. And yet, because the security cameras caught him with the bag, with the bombs, it was assumed that he was the bomber. And so for years, and in fact, he just passed, I think, this past year. I mean, he was basically dogged as the entire rest of his life because this 24/7 media scrutiny was that he was the bomber. And then why are we not saying it? We need to arrest him. And well, if you had really kind of done the legwork and done the journalism, you would have seen that, from the get-go, the law enforcement hadn't suspected that he was and really always kind of believed that he wasn't. But, media got that one wrong. And the same thing happened, it tends to happen in moments of great tragedy, 9/11, endless numbers of stories of people that we thought were dead and then it turned out that they weren't. And, you also look at the Boston bombing episode. In the rush to try to identify who these bombers were, they misidentified at least 3 different people. And unfortunately, one of the people had gone missing, committed suicide. And so it was, and so kind of put his family through the ringer because for days on end, we said, oh, this is the guy. And it turns out, of course, it wasn't. So there are challenges to journalists to make sure that we are not contributing to the problem. And unfortunately, we don't always get it right. And so, that is a real possibility that we've seen time and again. And it's one that I hope we, learn some difficult lessons from.
And I'm going to put on my psychology hat for a minute and say that in these times when some big, usually negative, scary event happens, one, you've got the media all racing to be the first with the scoop because the first with the scoop gets the kudos, gets more subscriptions in whatever form that takes these days. But there's another piece of this from the consumer side, from the public side, and that these big negative, scary events lead us to try to seek answers. Like we want to know why it happened. We want to get a resolution. We want to know who the bomber was. We want to put that person, get that person off the streets and bring them to justice as quickly as possible. We want the answer. We want an answer, which may not be the right answer, because an answer makes us feel like we have control back, right? I understand what happened. It's not going to happen again, or I understand how to make sure it doesn't happen again. And the combination of those two things leads to the potential for the belief of misinformation that then is hard to unbelieve and correct. One little factoid is when the media do get things wrong and they do issue a retraction, retractions get a magnitude less readership, viewership than the actual piece of misinformation. So like on social media, the retraction spreads a teeny bit in comparison to the initial piece, which means these things are stickier than we would want them to be, of course.
That's interesting. I think I did read an article recently that said, and we'll, again, how do you stop this? If you see something wrong, don't share it and say this is wrong, because all they'll do is read the thing that you shared and they won't read that this is wrong. So I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm sure I've done that before. Like I gotta stop. Just don't share it at all is the information, is the, really the guidance. So, but yeah, I see where you're coming from with the breaking news, because I subscribe to the New York Times and they're breaking news, breaking all day long. I'm like, that's not breaking. But a lot of the times I'm like, how is that breaking news? But it is like, I know a lot of them. It's like, well, I got to know why. I want to know why. I want to know how. I want to know who. And you click on it and it's usually very new and may or may not be accurate yet. So it's interesting. So here's another question about if people are being held accountable. So thinking back to the lawsuit from the Sandy Hook families and how they sued Alex Jones, successfully sued him for misinformation. He called the shooting of 20 students and 6 teachers a hoax. A lot of people believed him. They harassed the families from Sandy Hook, and they took him to court and they received a $1.5 billion judgment, which is huge. So I guess what I'm curious is if you have any idea if that kind of judgment has any effect on people trying to be more accountable for what they're spreading. And then there's other ones too that have happened recently, big, huge suits where they were sued and the plaintiffs were successful. So have you seen that having an impact?
Yes and no.
Right.
It kind of depends. I do think with the InfoWars case, the Alex Jones case, I think it does put a little bit of fear of God into those who are maybe looking to use a disinformation platform, and you can debate whether he was mis or dis. I think that I would qualify him for dis because he'd made a lot of money doing it. Whether or not he believed anything he said, he did it to make a lot of money and he was successful in doing it. Um, I think that case in particular, which really kind of hinged on a libel suit, it was really an eye opener to many that said, oh, okay, there are real consequences if I do this. I think you also look at Dominion v. Fox News, which is the case where Fox News was found liable for libeling the election systems during the election. Also had a chilling effect, and there's a similar suit against Newsmax making its way through the courts, which I think all those things certainly help. At the same time, you've got a president that doesn't particularly seem to care about what the courts say and kind of has, an untouchable air to him. So it is a strange time that we're in, that one of the largest purveyors of mis and disinformation can be, our own government. And so we have to be cognizant of that. And to some extent, every politician is a purveyor of disinformation. And certainly the Biden administration wasn't telling you things that that they didn't want you to hear. So I think the scale is of a different sort in the current administration, and it's something that we have to be aware of. And so I think there's progress. I'd like to see more progress, but Joanne, what do you think? Am I on the right road?
Yeah, I think you are. These suits require that there be somebody or some group that has been libeled or directly hurt by the misinformation, and that has to be a clear link has to be shown in court. So the Sandy Hook one was a slam dunk in this regard. The parents of these children who were killed were clearly defamed, libeled. I don't remember the difference between defamation and libel, but were legally that stuff.
Yeah.
And it was by the constant barrage of lies that these parents were making it up, right? That they were actors, that their kids hadn't died. Same thing with the Dominion lawsuit. It was a company that was defamed, and it was a very clear case of defamation. And I think, yes, on the margins, those suits may deter some bad actors with very large platforms, but those bad actors with very large platforms also are well financed and have good lawyers. And so there's the other side of that. I want to make a quick plug for a really fantastic book about the Sandy Hook hoax, all the information, the misinformation surrounding it. It's by Elizabeth Williamson, who's a journalist. It's a really terrific book. It's a difficult read in parts, and I think she did she interviewed me and some other misinformation conspiracy theory scholars, and connects to that work a little bit in chronicling that whole.
What's the book called?
I can't remember the name of the book now. It's by Elizabeth Williamson. I'm looking because I have it on my shelf and I can't see it because my eyes are bad. I'll figure it out. I'll let you know before the end of the.
You can type it in the chat if somebody figures it out. I did want to so Joan Wheeler asked, other than Spotlight Delaware, so Jake is calling you out, which I really appreciate. What are some trustworthy sources for news?
I tend to be a big believer in our local media. I know that some of them catch more of a bad rap than others, and I think that the information is accurate. So if you're looking for local news, I'm still subscribed to the News Journal. I know others have been turned off for a variety of reasons over the years. I think they have great journalists. When they do investigative work, the investigative work is good. I think they could do more investigative work. Um, I also am a big fan of our other nonprofit newsrooms, which are NPR affiliates. That's WHYY, just fantastic reporting, investigative reporting. And Delaware Public Media is a really strong small cadre of reporters as well. I would say support as much local media as your budget can, because what we do need is more working journalists rather than fewer working journalists, which is an issue. I would say the biggest thing I can tell people if we're discussing mis and disinformation, turn the TV off. I don't care if it's CNN, I don't care if it's Fox News, I don't care if it's MSNBC. All of it is an echo chamber. All of it is trying to feed you something that you want to hear. All of it is rarely news at this point. It's all commentary or opinion or editorial. So, with that in mind, turn it off. I'm a big believer that if you want to be engaged on the national scene, you should have a New York Times subscription in your household and you should have a Wall Street Journal subscription in your household. I have both. I don't believe that you should be one or the other. I think there are plenty of good arguments on either side. And I think that those are the two strongest news organizations we have in the country. So if your budget can afford it, a small donation to Spotlight Delaware first, and then get a New York Times, and that would be my plug.
That's awesome. That's interesting. It's funny that you said that because I don't watch or listen to the news anymore. I only read it because I can't hear them talking about the same thing for half an hour and like just very, very much spun a certain way. And I'm like, let me just read it and then read it from a bunch of different sources. So yeah.
I'm a big fan of 60 Minutes. 60 Minutes has always been in my household. I think if you're going to watch something, that is real journalism. Everything else is a talking head and, the guests lined up to support their point of view. So leave that as
This is another good point. Going back to, Melissa, something that you said earlier about that study about eighth graders not knowing that sponsored content wasn't a real news. This is with adults as well. Adults can't distinguish between opinion and news reporting.
Yeah.
And there's such a blend of those. And going back to something that Jake said earlier, I don't want to call it a decline in professional journalism, because I think that professional journalism is just as strong as it's always been. It's just watered down now by all of the fake journalists, and the opinion journalists wrapping their opinions up as fact. And it's much harder to distinguish between those unless you're really trying to.
Yeah, one of the major challenges, there was a Northwestern study that came out 2 years ago that basically found that it was a third of all newspapers in the country have closed since 2005, and 2/3 of the journalism jobs have been lost since 2005.
That's
Well,
huge.
I would agree that it is not that the quality is diminished, it's just that there's fewer of us doing the work. And
There.
unfortunately, what's happened is we've now filled in the gaps with influencers and bloggers and pundits and God, well, we have like three new kind of right-wing news channels, Newsmax and News Nation and all this stuff. And it doesn't do us any good. And it's a big reason why Spotlight Delaware has chosen to not have any opinion content on our website. Because in my 15 years of leading professional newsrooms, my number one complaint from readers was about op-eds. And they assumed that we wrote them. They assumed, and they were syndicated. We got them from God knows whoever. I didn't even put them on the page. A pagination department and Timbuktu would put them together, but when they would hit doorsteps, everybody assumes that's the implicit belief of this organization. That's factual news that people no longer can discern between opinion and news. And until I can feel good about the media literacy ecosystem that we now can again, it's something I'm just not that interested in engaging with.
Jen wants to know, how do you feel about my beloved PBS NewsHour?
Um, I love nonprofit news in general. I've had some bones to pick with PBS in recent years, and so if that's your choice, I think that they still do good work. I think that they've had some ethical lapses here in the last decade that have given me some pause. So take that as you will, and I encourage you to look into it.
So I am going to get to, because there's another question here, and this is what everybody really wants to know. So it'd be interesting to see what your advice is. How do you, oh wait, now it moved. How do you get people to accept reality and not just the lies that make them feel good? So how do we, it gets to the heart of what everybody wants to know. Like, how do you convince people when that was something that they're reading or seeing is not true?
So I think there are two questions here, or two ways to tackle this. One is, how do you convince other people? And then the other is, how do you not fall into the trap yourself? Because that first question, how do you convince other people, can have the implication that I don't do this, but other people do. And the reality is we all do it. And once we recognize that we all do this, and I saw it briefly pop up about implicit bias. There we go. I see it pop up now, the unconscious bias question. Once we are made aware of our implicit or unconscious biases, I mean, they're unconscious, right? So you have to actively be shown that you have these biases. It actually becomes very difficult. Like you have to really want to correct those biases and be really conscious of it. So work on implicit bias that in particular has shown implicit stereotype bias that all of us have, whether it's gender biases or race biases, stereotypes. All of this work, when you do an implicit bias test and you're shown that you have this bias, we all go, oh no, right? And we want to correct it. And now that we're aware that we have this implicit, right? We say, oh, that's bad. I don't want to act that way or feel that way or display those attitudes consciously. The problem with unconscious biases that are related to our own attitudes and confirmation biases is that there's no real incentive, sort of social world incentive, not to try to correct them, right? It makes us feel good to believe the things that to think that the world out there confirms what we believe, right? And then, so if you don't want to be that person, you have to stop and say to yourself, oh, that piece of information, that's exactly what I believed, right? Oh, wait a minute. Maybe I should look into it a little bit and see if it's really true. We've all done this. I've done this. I've shared a meme or I've shared something that someone then comes back and says, you know, that's AI generated. Like, oh, right. And I shared it because it made a joke that was funny to me because it was consistent with my attitudes, right? That knee-jerk share is the problem, right? In terms of the spread. Okay, I want to share that because it's what I believe, right? But let's hold off for a split second, right? Let's get rid of the sort of let's allow ourselves some potential delayed gratification in sharing it and confirm that it's true. How you talk other people down off the misinformation ledge, heck if I know, to be perfectly honest with you. In the conspiracy theory world, I can tell you the one thing that you don't want to do is mock, ostracize, criticize people who fall into these misinformation sort of rabbit holes. Because one of the reasons that they're in those rabbit holes and they stay in them is because these are their people, right? The deeper they go, the less connected they are with people out there who, in the real world, their friends, their family, their loved ones, the more they're pushed away, the harder it is for them to get back out. Okay. So I can tell you what not to do. It's harder to say what to do. Although I have more thoughts on that, but I'll hold that for now.
I agree with all that. I think, and again, I kind of go back to almost my, the family chat.
Mhm.
So it's like you have to thread a line between being polite and trying to steer people back towards good media literacy skills. And I would say it's better to try to practice good media literacy skills than it is to try to correct people. Because if you try to correct people, they are just going to turn off. And frankly, if you are a very progressive person and you're trying to convince your very conservative, cousin that your way is the right way, it's never going to happen. Now, can you convince them that the set of facts that they are dead set on believing are not accurate? I think you can have gentle conversations that kind of say, okay, well, show me the source or where did you hear this? And if people are sharing things with you, you can say, okay, well, I was trying to think of what it was. There was my father-in-law shared one with me a couple months ago that was like, the Trump administration was all up in arms that Biden was not finishing the border wall because goats were coming through, and they couldn't finish the wall where the goats were coming through. I was like, I'm a fairly savvy guy. I mean, I read the news every day. I've never heard this. Why is this suddenly in your talking points? And of course, if you get on Twitter or, whatever for about 30 seconds, you're like, okay, this is where this is coming from. And it's drawn out of the fact that, you know, a federal land, the Bureau of Land Management had kept, this small area in a very remote area open for wildlife to come through. And it was like, there's no evidence that migrants were using it at all, but we conflate the facts and now this is the narrative. And so you kind of just try to gently show me the source, show me the facts. Here's what they're basing it on, and see how it doesn't have anything to do with what this Twitter meme was talking about. But to be honest, it's going to be a tough. You're going to feel like you're pushing a boulder up a hill, and sometimes a foot of progress is good progress.
And do you think it's a lot more effective if you have, and this is like just what I'm thinking about how I've been doing things, is a lot more effective to have an actual conversation with someone than it is to try. I know I have tried many times to post facts on social media, like, hey, here's a fact from this source, check this out. Hoping that it will counter one that I know somebody posted that's completely not true. Doesn't work. So is it more effective to try to have a in-person conversation with someone to say, hey, where'd you get that information? And let me tell you what I've read or what I've found. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I think so. I'm going to say two things here about this. One is that from sort of right now I lost my first thing. Wait, hold it. I'll get it back in a sec. So, when you encounter somebody who has either fallen down this rabbit hole or really believes this thing that they want to believe, sometimes coming at it from a different angle. I don't want to say coming at it as if you're like attacking somebody, but instead of trying to counter the piece of misinformation with factual information, recognize that this person believes this thing for a reason, right? And maybe it's that reason that as a friend, a family member, a loved one, you want to get at the heart of. So I talk about this a lot when it came to misinformation spread around COVID. That COVID misinformation spread about the where the disease came from, what spreads it, how to get well once you get sick from it, how to prevent getting infected, and so forth. Lots of misinformation. A lot of that was born out of fear, anxiety, loss of control, uncertainty. Our world got completely upended, and we're trying to find answers, right? I may be able to convince you that COVID isn't spread by 5G towers by explaining to you that the reason that we see a relationship between 5G towers and COVID infections is because of population size. I may be able to show you the map and convince you that those two things appear at the same time and they're correlated with one another, but one doesn't cause the other. And I may be able to do that. But if you're still scared and if you're still uncertain, there's always another conspiracy theory piece of information that you can grab onto. And so Jake used the phrase whack-a-mole earlier, and that's exactly what this is. So instead, how about, hey, how are you feeling these days? This is really scary. Are you worried about your job? Are you worried about your kids' education now that they're home? Are you now juggling all sorts of things that you weren't able to juggle before? How can I help you with those things? Right? Not even touching the misinformation itself. Now that's my psychology hat, right? My psychology hat says, let's not tackle the piece of misinformation itself, but the motivations underlying the desire to believe these things. But real quick, I will say that there is some really cool new research that is looking at how to do sort of scalable misinformation interventions, say online, right? And one of the things that we're seeing now is that if you can get someone to talk to a chat box and you tell them that you believe that 9/11 was an inside job, talk to ChatGPT, or they say, and they're going to try to convince you that 9/11 wasn't an inside job. Talking to a chat box works.
Really?
And it works not only in the short term, but some of these studies have come back like a month later. The one study that I'm thinking of, and I'll find the source. I'll share it with you. You can share it. That correction actually sticks. Part of the reason I think it works is because that chat box is nonpartisan. Right? That chat box is perceived to be an objective source in a way that you, to your friend, are not an objective source. Right? So maybe that's a way that, and whether that's scalable or not remains
That
to
is
be.
really, really interesting. Although I would have a fear that the chatbot, like ChatGPT, would have the wrong information and spread the misinformation, but if
Right.
you can make it go the other way.
And I would have to guess, and I know the scholars did this study, David Rand and Gordon Pennycook and some others. I'm guessing they tested it out ahead of time with particular types of pieces of misinformation. But I would too be worried about putting that chatbot out into the real world and letting it do its thing and trying to convince people for the reasons that you suggest.
It's really interesting though. And then a lot of it is all based on faith. To the beginning part of your response there, just the fear is what with COVID, it was all, the fear just drove so many people to believe things that they wouldn't necessarily believe if they weren't so scared of what was happening in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo that and say that I think Joanne's psychology is right on point. I mean, that tends, fear and anxiety tends to be the driver about why mis and disinformation spreads so widely. It's typically fear of the other. It's the reason why, Russian intelligence officers find it so easy to manipulate us because all we got to say is, the Democrats are the problem, the Republicans are the problem, and we just kind of eat each other alive. And and even when I think about something like uh, picking on my poor father-in-law, but I think about he gets
I hope
really
he doesn't watch this.
yeah, exactly. My father too. I think everybody's father, right? Everybody's father is kind of on the same page. Really worked up about immigration. And I'm like, why? We don't live on a border state. You probably haven't seen a Hispanic guy this week. Why are you so concerned about? And it's typically not anything to do about immigration, but it's typically to do about economic opportunity and the fear that, they're taking our jobs or we're giving them too much money or what. It's usually concern or anxiety around finances. And if you can kind of understand what motivates somebody's fear and anxiety, I think it allows you to have better conversations about this really isn't, the problem, or, they're not taking your job, or we're not giving them too much, or whatever it is. There are wider, bigger reasons why the things are the way they are, and it kind of helps tamp down on people's fear and anxiety to a certain extent.
Yeah. I will say, and that,
Thanks, Jennifer.
yeah,
I can pick on her father-in-law now.
there you go. Exactly. I will pick on anyone's father-in-law right now, but I could pick on my sister because my sister and your father-in-law should probably be friends. I the one thing that I would say that I would caution against in thinking about ways to curb or correct misinformation is I would argue against censorship or prior restraints. Okay? And there are two reasons for this. One is who's doing the censoring, right? There may be, how many of us are in this? There are 18 of us now here. We may be able to agree on one or two types of information that we could all agree shouldn't be out there. Okay? But beyond that, right? How then we're going to start to say, well, that's not, well, we should let people have their views and talk about these things, and we want the information to be out there, and once we let that censorship rabbit out of the hat, I'm mixing all sorts of weird metaphors now, right? You can't get it back.
Right.
And also it doesn't work if it's another whack-a-mole game. Well, I can censor that piece of information, and oh, look, now this other thing crops up, and now I've got to censor that too, and now this has come up. And it's just not a workable solution.
So how, Jake, were you going to jump in? Because I was going to ask another question, but if you had
No,
some.
please, yeah.
So how can, we come from community-based organizations. How can community-based organizations and even individuals combat, I don't know if I can say effectively, but try to effectively combat the harmful effects of disinformation? Like what can we do?
Yeah, I think I think public schools need to be doing a better job on a number of things. Financial literacy and media literacy at the top of my list. I do think that we need to become more savvy about understanding who is giving us information and for what purpose. I think if people can start to understand what primary sourcing is. Are we hearing this directly from somebody that said it? Are we reading the study itself? Are we hearing this, fourth person in the daisy chain down? And are they giving us, an accurate representation of what the facts are? I think that in my mind is something that we can practice in our own lives, in our own organization. I think that in times of crisis or stress, we should check ourselves that we are not contributing to the problem instead of presenting a solution. I have been somewhat critical of nonprofits even in these last 3 months because there's been a big rush to, we're going to lose all our funding. Nobody's really talked about cutting your funding yet. Is there an atmosphere of concern? Yeah. But how many press releases and press conferences have I received invites to in the last 3 months from nonprofits? When I looked into it, I'm like, I don't see anywhere where we talked about cutting your money. And I don't think that lends itself well to the conversation. It will breed distrust to people that distrusted you to begin with, and it will only erode trust from people that did trust you. So I think that we need to be cognizant of what we share with others and really try to practice best practices.
We, for one, did have a grant terminated, and I know other
Yeah,
nonprofits who had grants
and I
terminated.
know
So
many
I will
didn't.
tell you that's not true. Some of us have had grants terminated.
One of
because
my biggest concerns is like Medicaid. Like they've had 3 or 4 press conferences now about cuts to Medicaid. That is nothing more than a proposal that some people are talking about. But the way that it's being discussed is it's a done deal. And I don't think that serves the public well if that's the talking point.
And it's fear.
Yeah.
It is. I mean, I will agree. We
Absolutely
have
fair.
a huge fear that we're going to lose more. And so, yeah, I totally agree.
Yes. All of what Jake said is dead on, and I'll add to it from the community side. So again, if we think about what has happened in this country, and not just this country, in terms of political polarization over the past couple of decades, right? That political polarization and the negative affect, what we call affective polarization, I really don't like the other side anymore. That polarization breeds the desire to believe anything you can. Also, it breeds confirmation bias, right? One, because you really, really want to hold on to your beliefs because they're who you are and they make you not them, right? And they're bad, right? And so beliefs become possessions in a way that we hold on to, and they're part of our identities. And they make us as a group the good group, right? The other group is as the bad group. And that, so one things and that also is exacerbated by the fact that we have become much more sorted, is what it's called. Democrats hang out with Democrats, Republicans hang out with Republicans. We have less cross-cutting identities anymore. It used to be that you'd go to church and you'd spend time with friends who go to your same church who might be of different political leanings. Those things don't happen anymore. We have liberal churches, we have conservative churches, right? For example. And so one of the things that community organizations, community groups that bring folks together can do is work on finding common ground, sort of building those cross-cutting cleavages, connections between people who only might see each other and interact with each other at these community events. But building those connections where now it's like, hey, I know that liberal or that conservative, they're not super bad people, right? To the extent that we can reduce some of that negative affect, reduce some of that polarization, and decrease the need to hold on to our beliefs so tightly because they're who we are, is a way I think that community organizations, again, notice I didn't say counter argue misinformation at all in that discussion, because it's up here. It's before we even get to the misinformation that where we might be able to make some progress in preventing people from even wanting to or needing to believe in the first place.
Trying to see people as people. That's been the hardest, I mean, honestly, I think that's the hardest thing. I think before it's gotten so divided, you didn't care what other people's beliefs were. As long as you liked them and had common interests, it was great. But now it's so polarized that it's you just see people as us and them. It's really, yeah, it's interesting. I am going to open it up to see if there's any other questions. I will, you know what, and Becca pointed out an article which Jake, interesting that you said about the finance education and the media education in the schools, because I've always been, so I worked at a bank for 26 years and I was always like, oh, we need to teach kids more about finances in the schools. Like I made sure my kids knew the difference between a credit card and a debit card and why not to go into debt and all, you know, about interest and compounding and all that stuff. And I'm like, they really need to teach this to kids. But now I think media literacy is just as important. And Delaware did pass a law in 2022 requiring the schools in Delaware to teach media literacy, which would be great if that happened across the country. Could help. And I was rereading the article today to prepare for this, and you know, it was saying that should get, you know, kids come home, talk about what they learned with their parents, so that would then get up to the parents as well. So be great if that happens more across the country. So, does anybody have, we're getting close to the end here. Anybody have any other questions? You can come off mute, ask a question, or type it in the chat.
And in particular, to the person who asked the implicit bias question, I'm not sure I quite answered your question. So if you have a follow-up, or if I didn't quite answer what you were asking, feel free to chime in or re-ask. I think I kind of went off in a couple of different directions and I lost the thread.
I think you got it. I think yeah, it's just how our implicit bias can play into it. And of course, reading what you already believe is true is the best way to do that.
Mhm.
I don't see any other questions. Oh, wait, here we go. I just want to say thank you, but I have to leave now. That's awesome. Thanks, Jen.
Thank
All
you.
right. Well, so first, well, I do want to say thank you to Joanne, and to Jake, but also to Becca for putting all of this together and organizing it. But it was a great conversation, and hopefully everybody learned something from it today, or just found out some interesting facts.